Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the first article of impeachment. The clerk will read the second article of impeachment.
Article 2, Obstruction of Congress. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment and that the President shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. In his conduct of the office of the President of the United States and in violation of his constitutional oath faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States and, to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald J. Trump has directed the unprecedented, categorical, and indiscriminate defiance of subpoenas issued by the House of Representatives pursuant to its sole power of impeachment. President Trump has abused the powers of the presidency in a manner offensive to and subversive of the Constitution, in that the House of Representatives has engaged in an impeachment inquiry focused on President Trump's corrupt solicitation of the government of Ukraine to interfere in the 2020 United States presidential election. As part of this impeachment inquiry, the committee's undertaking the investigation serves subpoenas seeking documents and testimony deemed vital to the inquiry from various executive branch agencies and offices and current and former officials. In response, without lawful cause or excuse, President Trump directed executive branch agencies, offices, and officials not to comply with those subpoenas. President Trump thus interposed the powers of the presidency against the lawful subpoenas of the House of Representatives and assumed to himself functions and judgments necessary to the exercise of the sole power of impeachment vested by the Constitution in the House of Representatives. President Trump abused the powers of his high office through the following means. 1, directing the White House to defy a lawful subpoena by withholding the production of documents sought therein by the committees. 2, directing other executive branch agencies and offices to defy lawful subpoenas and withhold the production of documents and records from the committees, in response to which the Department of State, Office of Management and Budget, Department of Energy, and Department of Defense refused to produce a single document or record. 3, directing current and former executive branch officials not to cooperate with the committees, in response to which 9 administration officials defied subpoenas for testimony, namely John Michael Mick Mulvaney, Robert B. Blair, John A. Eisenberg, Michael Ellis, Kristen Wells Griffith, Russell T. Vaught, Michael Duffy, Brian McCormick, and T. Ulrich Reckbull. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous efforts to undermine United States government investigations into foreign interference in United States elections. Through these actions, President Trump sought to arrogate to himself the right to determine the propriety, scope, and nature of an impeachment inquiry into his own conduct, as well as the unilateral prerogative to deny any and all information to the House of Representatives in the exercise of its sole power of impeachment. In the history of the Republic, no president has ever ordered the complete defiance of an impeachment inquiry or sought to obstruct and impede so comprehensively the ability of the House of Representatives to investigate high crimes and misdemeanors. This abuse of office served to cover up the president's own repeated misconduct and to seize and control the power of impeachment, and thus to nullify a vital constitutional safeguard vested solely in the House of Representatives. In all of this, President Trump has acted in a manner contrary to his trust as president and subversive of the constitutional government, to the great prejudice of the cause of law and justice, and to the manifest injury of the people of the United States. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States.
The question is on the second article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent, Donald John Trump, guilty or not guilty? The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Ms. Baldwin. Guilty. Mr. Barrasso. Not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Guilty. Mrs. Blackburn.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. Guilty. Mr. Blunt. Not guilty. Mr. Booker. Guilty. Mr. Bozeman. Not guilty. Mr. Braun. Not guilty. Mr. Brown. Guilty. Mr. Burr. Not guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Guilty. Mrs. Capito. Not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Guilty. Mr. Carper. Guilty. Mr. Casey. Guilty. Mr. Cassidy. Not guilty. Ms. Collins. Not guilty. Mr. Coons. Guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Guilty. Mr. Cotton. Not guilty. Mr. Kramer. Not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Not guilty. Mr. Cruz. Not guilty. Mr. Daines. Not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Guilty. Mr. Durbin. Guilty. Mr. Enzi. Not guilty. Ms. Ernst. Not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Guilty. Mrs. Fisher. Not guilty. Mr. Gardner. Not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand. Guilty. Mr. Graham. Not guilty. Mr. Grassley. Not guilty. Ms. Harris. Guilty. Ms. Hassan. Guilty. Mr. Hawley. Not guilty. Mr. Heinrich. Guilty. Ms. Hirono. Guilty. Mr. Hoven. Not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Not guilty. Mr. Johnson.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Jones. Guilty. Mr. Kane. Guilty. Mr. Kennedy. Not guilty. Mr. King. Guilty. Ms. Klobuchar. Guilty. Mr. Langford. Not guilty. Mr. Leahy. Guilty. Mr. Lee.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mrs. Loeffler. Not guilty. Mr. Manchin. Guilty. Mr. Markey. Guilty. Mr. McConnell. Not guilty. Ms. McSally. Not guilty. Mr. Menendez. Guilty. Mr. Merkley. Guilty. Mr. Moran. Not guilty. Ms. Murkowski. Not guilty. Mr. Murphy. Guilty. Mrs. Murray. Guilty. Mr. Paul.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Perdue. Not guilty. Mr. Peters. Guilty. Mr. Portman? Not guilty. Mr. Reed? Guilty. Mr. Risch? Not guilty. Mr. Roberts? Not guilty. Mr. Romney? Not guilty. Ms. Rosen? Guilty. Mr. Rounds? Not guilty. Mr. Rubio? Not guilty. Mr. Sanders? Guilty. Mr. Sass? Not guilty. Mr. Schatz? Guilty. Mr. Schumer? Guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida? Not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? Not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen? Guilty. Mr. Shelby? Not guilty. Ms. Sinema? Guilty. Ms. Smith? Guilty. Ms. Stabenow? Guilty. Mr. Sullivan? Not guilty. Mr. Tester? Guilty. Mr. Thune? Not guilty. Mr. Tillis? Not guilty. Mr. Toomey? Not guilty. Mr. Udall? Guilty. Mr. Van Hollen? Guilty. Mr. Warner? Guilty. Ms. Warren? Guilty. Mr. Whitehouse? Guilty. Mr. Wicker? Not guilty. Mr. Wyden? Guilty. Mr. Young? Not guilty.
All right, and there you have it. On the second article of impeachment, obstruction of Congress, the vote is 47 guilty, 53 not guilty on that vote. As we watch this play out, obviously the obstruction of Congress charge was largely leveled at a lack of cooperation from the White House on witnesses that they wanted to bring in to be part of this investigation on the House side, and now the senators have stood at their desks and voted 57 to 43.
53-47.
53 to 47 not guilty on the floor of the Senate in the case of Donald Trump. Let's listen to the Supreme Court
Senators
justice.
have pronounced Donald John Trump, President of the United States, guilty as charged. 53 senators have pronounced him not guilty as charged. 2/3 of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that respondent Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the second article of impeachment.